he, yeah, I think I
All right, everybody. Um, Good afternoon. And let's jump right into this week's Parsha. So this week's Parsha, it is a unique opportunity that is really only available to us in a leap year, in the fact that this Parsha gets its own focus and attention, as we've been discussing really kind of throughout this year. This whole year has been a leap year, and has given us the opportunity to expand out each of the double portions that we would otherwise kind of truncate together to be able to complete the cycle of Torah portions in the limited amount of weeks that is in a non-leap year. But this year, being that it is a leap year, we get to give each one of these Torah portions its own Shabbat, for its own focus and attention and study. So Parshat Ki Tavo, which usually is paired with the Parsha before it, Parshat Ki Teitze, we are now able to spend an entire week of focus just on the lessons in this week's Parsha, in Parshat Ki Tavo. Now, we've been discussing that Moshe uses a well-known academic device throughout his long speech here that has taken us all the way through the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, as we are now kind of approaching the end of it. We have after this Ki Tavo, after this week's parsha, we have Nitzavim Vayelech, Ha'azinu, and Zot Bracha, and then we are done. And Zot Bracha really is, it's Ha'azinu really is its own thing. It's known as Shirat Moshe, the Song of Moshe, and Vezot HaBracha are his final blessings. So both of those are kind of their own standalone feature. So we are really kind of coming to the end of Moshe's extended soliloquy, as it were. But throughout it, Moshe has used a particular device, and that is contrast. He has kind of spoken to opposites and juxtaposed those opposites so that we can appreciate the value of each of each side of the contrast. So we said that, for example, the Etchanan was the big ideas, and Akev were the small ideas. Then we had Akev Tishmun, which was hearing, and then the next parsha was Re'eh, which was seeing. And in last week's Torah portion and this week's Torah portion, we are given another set of contrasts. And it's quite obvious that they seem to be opposites. What does Ki Teitze mean?
Go out.
Which was last Torah portion, when you will go out. And what does Ki Tavo mean?
You will come in.
When you will come in, right? So literally, kind of opposite points. When you go out and when you'll come in. And so right there, again, we are kind of playing with those contrasts. Ki Teitze LaMilchama, when you will go out to battle. Vayya Ki Tavo, and it is when you will come home and settle. Now, the parsha opens up Vayya Ki Tavo El Haaretz, and it will be when you will come into the land after the adversity. And we discussed this about two weeks ago, because there was a similar refrain to this discussion 2 weeks ago, in which Moshe was acknowledging that he has to prepare the people for a different scenario and circumstance that they have experienced heretofore. Up until this point, the Jewish people have honed and mastered their perseverance and their ability to stand up to challenge that was persecutorial by nature, where they were either slaves or wandering, and it was difficult and it was hard, and that they managed to cling to God despite all the turbulent waters and the difficulties that faced the people. That was their story and their history up until this moment, where they stand on the threshold of entering the land, right? For 210 years, they were slaves, and then they were wandering people. And Moshe had discussed to them what it is that they have at their disposal and what they have already availed themselves of to deal with these circumstances. But Moshe warned that there's a different set of challenges, a different set of difficulties. And those are the difficulties that will come when actually things are hunky-dory. Not that the challenge will come despite the hunky-doriness, despite the ease and in a sense the comfort of life, but actually the ease and the comfort itself is the challenge. And to a certain degree, while we talked about the public responsibility of how to establish a society that will be able to combat these matters. When you establish a society and the society is well placed and is secure, how to protect against that society falling into decadence and immorality. This week's Torah portion focuses on the individual. And as last week we said, V'haya ki tetzela milchama, right? And again, we noticed, and as we've been pointing out, that the verse doesn't say ki tetzu, when you plural, when you guys will go out to battle. Rather, vaya ki tetze, when you as an individual will go out to battle. And so we discussed last week the individual battle that one goes and deals with. Not only the battle of facing the enemies of your nation, the enemies of your society, but rather the battles you face when you battle yourself, right? We talked about in Shul, the fact that life is full of challenges, not just for peoples, but also for individuals. And a person battles their circumstances. A person battles other people. It doesn't just mean in military battle, but it could be a battle of wills and interests. And then there is battling yourself, which is the harder battle. And we talked about battling yourself in the context of battling others, where you're facing outward challenges and therefore are a little bit more susceptible to that voice within you that says, all is excusable in order to win and succeed in the challenges, to win the war. The ends justify the means, right? As we see very often is the case in military battle, people act in ways that are completely unacceptable, but are accepted in this circumstance because at least we need to win the battle. So it's excused. It's excused for the sake of the greater victory. And the Torah says there is no such thing. And this parsha talks about V'haya ki tavo. And it is when you will come home. And it is when you will settle. And things will all of a sudden, you won't be on that battlefield. And you will be in a time of comfort and serenity, and oftentimes a time of plenty and largesse, etc. And then you are going to be facing that other battle. The battle of where I don't have to turn to God. I don't have to see the address. I don't have to go to God's address because that's the only address available to me. Rather, I can, to a certain degree, live like others do, bask in my success, bask in my plenty, bask in my peace and comfort, without, to a certain degree, acknowledging God. And so we talked about how we establish a society to protect against that. But what about the individual? How does the individual in their own personal life protect against this? And so that is why the parsha opens up. V'hayaki tavo al haaretz. And it'll be when you will come to the land asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha, that God gives you as an inheritance. V'yorishta v'yashavta ba. And you will inherit it and you will settle it. And you will settle down. You will settle down. Life will become good and easy. And says the Torah, here's the strategy. V'lakachta mereshit kol pri ha'adama, and you will take of the very first of all the fruits of the land that you will bring from the land, and you will put it into a basket. And you will go to the place that God has chosen to place his name upon it. And you will come to the Kohanim that will be in those days, V'amarta elav, and you will say to him, I have come to declare before God because I have arrived on the land that God has promised. And you will say as follows, as the Kohen takes that basket of the first fruits and will place it on the altar, you will say as follows. And these words should be very familiar to us. The Aramean had threatened to annihilate my father, and he went down to Egypt, and he sojourned there, few in number, and he was there a great nation, mighty and multitudinous. And the Egyptians persecuted us, and they oppressed us, and they placed upon us much hard work. And we cried out to God, and the God of our fathers, and he heard us, and he saw our oppression, our hard work, and the pressure that was placed upon us. And God took us out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with much awesome power, with signs and with wonders. Anybody know why this is very familiar?
The Seder.
This is the backbone of the Seder night, the backbone of the Haggadah. And as we've talked about in the lead up to Pesach, the bulk of the Haggadah is very Talmudic, in which we quote a verse and we pick it apart. Now, why is that what we do at the Haggadah? Because we are given a command in the Torah in quadruplicate. 4 times the Torah says, on that day, which is the night of the Seder, the anniversary of the leaving of Egypt, when your children will ask you, you will respond and you will tell them the story. V'higadat alavincha. You will tell to them. You will relate to them. So it's a biblical commanded, repeated in quadruplicate. 4 times this command is repeated in the Torah. Now, like any command that we are given by God, we take it very seriously, and we want to understand it, and we want to be able to execute it as accurately and as properly as possible. So when God says, tell over the story, well, what constitutes the story? How do I fulfill this obligation of telling over the story, and know that in doing so, by saying this point and this point and this point, and not leaving out this point and this point, I have satisfactorily fulfilled my obligation to tell the story. So, and when the Torah gives us this command to tell the story, the Torah does not say, and thus you shall say, and this is what you shall say. It just says, you shall tell over the story. So we're kind of left a little bit, with a conundrum. How do I fulfill this obligation of telling the story of Egypt? I need to fulfill this obligation. Where do I start? Where do I end? Which details do I need to leave? I need to fill in. And so we look at, we scour the rest of the Torah, God's instruction manual, and we are looking, is there anywhere else in the Torah where God says, and this is the story? And we find it here in the book of Devarim, where it tells us, as we just read, that once you come into the land, and you will be bringing up your first fruits. You shall tell over the story, and thus you shall say. And it gives us the script right here. We just read it. So this script becomes the backbone of the Haggadah, because we know that in reciting and retelling this verbatim, we will have fulfilled the obligation. But as we know, as the introduction to telling over the story was in the Avadim Hayinu, we say, Cholamar belesaper harezem shubach, all who expound, who exceedingly tell over the story are praiseworthy. Everybody has to become a rabbi on the night of the Seder, which is something that could be said in 10 words or less. You have to say in 10 paragraphs or more. And so because Harizem Meshubach, and we validate that point by telling of 5 rabbis, right, who tell the story all night. So we're not going to suffice with saying, okay, everybody sit down, and right before we eat this wonderful meal, we have to recite 5 verses here. Well done, let's eat. Rather, we say, okay, here are the verses. Well, what are the details of each of the verses? What does it mean when an Aramean sought to annihilate my father? What is that? That is the story of Lavan, of Laban, who tried to wipe out Yaakov. What do you mean he tried to wipe him out? He was going to do something worse than even Pharaoh and the Egyptians, because Pharaoh, even in his decree to kill every last one of the Jewish males, was only about the males. Yaakov wanted to Lavan wanted to kill Yaakov and his family, which would have been the entirety of the Jewish people, which itself has an important lesson to give over at the night of the Seder, which is one does not appreciate the repercussions of even what they consider small acts, right? There is that quote in the Talmud that one who saves the Jewish life as if they saved an entire world, right? As quoted later in Schindler's List, right? The end of Schindler's List. And this point is driven home with the opposite, one who threatens a life. It's as if they threaten a whole world, because had Lavan gone through with just killing a few people, right, that he had a grudge against, there would never have been a Jewish people. And so this tells us we never know how our small little act today, what the ramifications are into the future. And so we have to be very careful in what we do. So all that information, how we just read the words, the Aramean threatened our father, right? We wouldn't have been able to drive this point home. That is why sometimes the rabbis are justified with their expansive rhetoric. That's just a plug for the rabbis.
Why not?
Why not? Exactly. I will later go around to all the rabbis and collect a certain amount of retainer fee for advocating on their behalf. But either way, now the question is, I understand that this belongs at the night of the Seder, the anniversary of the date that God did this for us, the anniversary of the time that we are supposed to share gratitude. In fact, this also is a halachic a halachic responsibility on us, that if we are the beneficiaries of a particularly miraculous salvation from God, we become we are in the hospital, we survive, or we were in an terrible accident, and we survive, or any other circumstance, we have a responsibility to do what is referred to as a seudat hoda'ah, right? A feast of thanksgiving.
I thought we had to say the golem prayer.
And not the golem, the gomel.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That's so
Right.
funny.
Hopefully we don't say the golem prayer. Right. If you don't do the gomel prayer, then you're a golem. Right. But
That
yes.
was a good one.
Right. So yes, absolutely correct. In the immediate, at our first opportunity to say thank you, we do so. But then we also go and we have a feast in which we bring family and friends and publicly in this moment, we have to tell the story of our salvation. And there are many that see it also as a halachic obligation that year in, year out, on the day, on the anniversary of that date, to do it again. Kind of what Purim is, what Hanukkah is, what Pesach is. But now comes the question. Now, not too long after Pesach, we have Shavuot. And Shavuot, besides for being the holiday in which we celebrate the giving of the Torah, and the holiday in which we celebrate the harvest, because that's generally when the harvest comes. It's Shavuot on the end of the spring season. Pesach is the holiday of the planting, beginning of the spring season. Shavuot is the harvest season, it's the end of spring, everything has grown, and now you're harvesting it. And then Sukkot, which is the last in that trifecta, is when you gather it in. You leave the grain that you've harvested out on the field and to dry over the course of the summer, and then right before the rainy season, you bring it in to the silos. And that's Sukkot. But Shavuot has another aspect to this. It is also called Chag HaBikurim. And that is because on Shavuot, this procedure would occur. This is when the processions would come up to Jerusalem with everybody with their first fruit of the new trees that they planted, etc., etc. And every year, if you would have new fruit, you would add it, you would put your basket, you would put them in the basket. What does it mean by the first fruit? It means if you plant a tree, then the first fruit that start to develop, you put a little ribbon around that particular branch. So you can remember that's the first fruit. And on on Shavuot, you are in the lead up to Shavuot, you add that fruit to the basket. And you bring up that first fruit of this particular tree. And you bring it up to God, and you bring it as this offering. You don't eat it. You put it on the altar and as an offering to God, and you make this declaration. Now the question is, this is not the anniversary of that great salvation that you are speaking about, right? It's all about Pesach. And that's in fact why it becomes the anchor of the Haggadah, right? That's the day that God saved us. So why do we reserve the public declaration and celebration of that salvation to Shavuot and to this process of bringing up the first fruit? This has nothing to do with that moment of leaving Egypt. So why are we making this declaration with the first fruit? And the answer to that question is the way we started this discussion. Because the answer is absolutely it does. How does one stay humble and grateful to God and cognizant of God, even as life becomes good? It is the constant and regular acknowledgement that these fruit are actually because of God. Not just because I was in a very bad way once upon a time. God saved me from that. Had God not saved me from that, I would not have been able to come to this land and have the fruit. So to a certain degree, all subsequent goodness is I need to pay kudos to God. Because had it not been for him, then I would not have been here. It's kind of like, always acknowledging the benefactor who gave you the seed money to start the business, right? So even though now as the business has grown, et cetera, that original seed money might be relatively insignificant, all things considered, but there's always that outsized debt of gratitude to the person who got you started. Because without them, none of this would have been possible, right? And so those founding members, founding contributors, whatever it is you want to call it, even as you go further along, you will always remember and always acknowledge them. So in a very basic way, that's the answer. And in a very basic way, this is a very important thing to always remember that this started with God, with God's salvation. And you wouldn't have been able to get here without God's salvation. So to a certain degree, every fruit that grows has a certain amount of God's salvation built into it, right? That's one way of understanding. And that is an important truth. It's kind of what we do when we say Moda ani lefanecha, right? God, you've returned my soul to me at the start of the day. Therefore, whatever happens today, whatever goodness and whatever I do, really to a certain degree, God, you get a credit for it. There's a certain amount of credit you get into everything. Because if I did not wake up today, nothing else that I would do today would have been possible. And it's kind of what we're acknowledging on Rosh Hashanah. As I begin a new year, God, I realize to a certain degree that I could only begin a new year because of you, because you're the creator. This whole world wouldn't exist without you. So whatever it is that I do and whatever, so there's that tacit understanding that the start of everything, God, is you. You are the point of origin of everything. And as the point of origin of everything, everything that comes subsequently is thanks to you. And that would keep you humble, even as you go later to produce. And later this kind of becomes your show and your effort and your enterprise. But there's always that tacit acknowledgement that it only becomes my show, God, because you started me off. And it only becomes my success because of your original investment. And so that is why when we are experiencing the first fruits, no pun intended, and literally no pun intended, because that's actually where the term comes from. Now you know. It is a reference, it's back to this biblical reference of bringing the first fruits and that acknowledgement that what we say, the first fruits of my success, I acknowledge that I only come to this success back because of the original salvation of God, back that has made this possible when I was in a far more vulnerable and imprisoned state. And I needed God to give me, to free me to pursue this. That is of all importance, that is so important and does in fact keep somebody incredibly humble and incredibly grateful. But it's far more than that. It's far more than that. Because the inherent flaw of this outlook is what? That God's role in this is as the original investor, as the point of origin, as the one who started you off. And then you took it from there. And you've made it a success. And you've built this business, etc., etc., etc. That is flawed logic. That is a flawed perspective.
Because God is involved every single day, every single minute.
Yeah. God is not the original investor.
He's the constant investor.
He is the continuous, the continual, the constant gardener, right? That's, I don't even know what that film is, but I know it's a film called The Constant Gardener, right?
Right. Yeah.
But God is the constant. And why, what do we mean? How do we acknowledge that by referencing back to Egypt? Because to a certain degree, it's the same thing we are saying when we are saying, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God, your God, God introduces himself as the one who Asher, what?
Took you
Did
out
what?
of Egypt.
Took you out of Egypt. Now, wait a minute. That is by far not God's greatest feat. God's greatest feat is what we are about to acknowledge in a couple days from now. Right? I am God your God
Brought you out of
who
slavery.
created heaven and earth.
Oh, yeah.
I am the creator. Like, hello, right? On his business card, it's going to say the creator. That's the big thing, right? That's God's biggest role, right? I'm not going to say, I am Rabbi Sender Gaizinski, trash collector of Chabad Bethesda. I do that too, right? But that's not my biggest role here, right? I am God, your God, who created, I am the creator. So this question is posed by the Talmud, many answers given. One of the answers is, yeah, but that's kind of impersonal, right? That he did for all of existence. This he did specifically for the Jewish people, right? So that it's like more localized. But you know what's even more localized? I am God, your God, who breathed the soul of life into you. You're alive because of me, right? That's pretty darn personal. And one would argue quite more significant than who took you out of Egypt. Because while, yeah, sure, God, I am grateful that you took me out of Egypt. But you know what I'm even more grateful for? The fact that I'm alive. Right? The fact that I'm living, the fact that I exist, period. So why again? Why is it I am God your God who took you out of Egypt? Why is that the way God chooses to introduce himself? And by the way, it doesn't say who took you guys, you plural, out of Egypt. It says, I am God your God who took you, asher hotzeiticha, not asher hotzeitchem, right? Asher hotzeiticha, that took you personally out of Egypt, right? What also makes that strange is the fact that it kind of becomes irrelevant past that first generation. Forget nowadays, even one generation, when it gets repeated later in the Parshat Ve'et Hanan in the book of Deuteronomy, it's already irrelevant. I am God, your God, who took you out of Egypt. Moses, point of order. We weren't in Egypt. You know, that was that earlier generation, you know, that generation from 40 years ago. We actually, you know, God, yeah, he took us through the desert. He's the God who's taking us into the land of Israel. That's all true. But as a matter of fact, he didn't take us out of Egypt. We were never slaves to Pharaoh. And yet we said it then, and we still say it today. And when we are bringing the first fruits, we say, right, that God took us, took me, right? We, you know, like all about Egypt, all about Egypt. What is this obsession with Egypt? And the answer is because when we are bringing the first fruits, we are not just focusing on our gratitude and our gratefulness and the kindnesses that God does for us. More importantly, when I look at the resources that I have before me, my focus is on not my gratefulness, but on my purpose. God declared, when I am taking you out of Egypt, it is not simply to right a moral wrong of one nation enslaving another nation. In fact, God says, I'm not taking you out of slavery. I'm not taking you out of servitude. The goal here is not to liberate you from servitude. What is the goal? When I will take you out of Egypt, says God, Tavdun et Elokim baharazeh. I am taking you out of Egypt in order that you shall serve me. It was a purpose-driven action. God says, I am taking you out of Egypt to press you into service. No longer shall you serve Egypt and its purpose and Pharaoh's purpose. I am removing him from his servitude to make you and to press you into my service. And so it continues. And when I am sitting in the land of Israel, and I am on my homestead, and I've sweated and toiled, and up come the fruits, and out comes the milk, and the honey, and everything else that the land of Israel is blessed with, I have three ways I can look at it. One is, look at me, right? I am a chevrama, or a chevra lady. And I've worked hard, I've earned this, and now I am going to indulge in it as is my right. Right? And God warns against this. Kochi va'otzem yadi asali et hachayil hazeh. Right? I'm going to go in the ways of my heart, b'shrirut libi elech. Why? Because I have produced this kind of success, and it is my success, and I get to benefit and indulge in it, as is my right. And I'm not being immoral or incorrect or unfair. I worked, I produced, I benefit. Capitalism, baby. It's not immoral. It's not unjust.
Mm.
God says, nope. There's a second perspective in which, as the bounty comes up, I look at it and I say, how blessed am I? How wonderful all this is. How grateful I am to God for providing it to me. And as I indulge in God's blessing, I also have to be aware that God, in his kindness, I must emulate so, and so I have to share. And I have to be kind. And to share God's blessing to me with others that did not have the same blessing. And to understand that that is, in fact, uh, my what is right and correct. Just would be that I get to keep what is mine legally, and I don't impinge or impose on others, invade their space, or take incorrectly. Kind and good is to understand that I have been blessed, and it is my role to share the blessing. But that's only the second. That is better, but it is not yet the truly correct way, the true and correct perspective. Rather, the true correct perspective is to say, all this bounty, all these assets and resources, this is God's investment in me. When God took me out of Egypt, he did so with a purpose in mind. He gave me a purpose. He made me his partner. And he is investing in me, his partner. This is not mine. I am not the end of the road. I am not meant to be the recipient. I am meant to be the conduit I am the middleman. This is the fruition of the strategy, as it were, and the business plan, the mission plan that God had articulated to me. God says, I am taking you out of Egypt. I am making you my people. I am putting you in an executive position. But the role of the executive is to execute. You have a fiduciary responsibility to the world. You need to remind yourself of this every time blessing is introduced into your life. So, one way to respond to God's blessing is to feel a sense of pride, arrogance, entitlement. Second way to respond to God's blessing is to feel a sense of gratitude and humbleness. Third way to respond to God's blessing is to feel a sense of responsibility and empowerment. Clearly, God trusts me with this amount of assets to do good with it, to utilize it to advance the purpose of the entire world. We are not just talking about physical or material or financial assets. Certain people, God blesses with a lot of wealth, with a lot of first fruits. And certain people, God blesses with an incredibly charismatic personality. And certain people, God blesses with an incredible mind or with great willpower or great strength. God blesses everybody. There isn't a person in the world that God has not invested in. Because you know what it looks like when God doesn't invest? That person doesn't exist. Literally, not that that person does exist, you can't find that person, but that person wouldn't be here. If that person's here, it's an indication that God has invested in them. Give me one moment, everybody, I'm sorry. That it is, I think that it is, I just noticed it. So you're talking about the people that feel like God owes them, and so when they do experience some sort of blessing in life, that's just God, that's just recompense. And
Right.
therefore, they don't have to share that out because they are meant to be the end of the line for that because God owes them and they don't have to be the conduit. And I think the best response, besides for saying to them, oh, well, that's, you know, uh, that's selfish or whatever, you know, etc. I think the the better approach is, as we're talking about in the ideal perspective, is when you understand that the whole reason we all exist in this world is not to be an end user, right? Not to be the end of the line, but more beautifully and more powerfully to be part of the of the progress, to not be sitting in the audience, but to be on stage, right? To be on the field, right? However exciting it is to be a spectator, it is obviously far more fulfilling and exciting to be part of the ones that are getting it done. Then you turn to that person and say, it's actually the greatest blessing when God gives you assets for the sake of moving things forward to be part of the solution to a thing like the Holocaust, rather than simply to be the victim who is finally being given some sort of arbitrary recompense. God is giving you the greatest blessing when he's put you in a position to do something about it. To be in the driver's seat.
Yeah, you know, some of the largest donors to Jewish things are Holocaust survivors. You know that. We all know that. And some of the most miserly people are those that have been through the Holocaust. It all depends on how you respond to it.
It all just, and what it comes down to is perspective.
Yeah.
And sometimes the most giving people are the people that have very little.
Right.
And the most miserly are the people that have plenty to give. And it's about perspective. And the one thing is almost invariably, the people that are giving are happier than the people that don't. And the reason for that is because as you give, there's that sense of fulfillment in you that feels so correct. And this is something, speaking of the Holocaust, and we talked about this, Hitler could never understand. Hitler says that one of the worst things that the Jewish people ever did, it was perpetrate and perpetrate an unnatural existence upon the people called conscience, right? Morality, etc., etc. He says it's unnatural. Look, the laws of the jungle, Darwinism. And so the Jewish people handicapped humanity by introducing an idea that people should be altruistic, that the strong and the rich should bend over to help the weak and those less powerful. Says that's unnatural. And if he was correct and it was unnatural, then he would, I wouldn't say necessarily justified, but there would be some validity to his approach. You cut out that which is unnatural and unhealthy. But he was entirely incorrect, criminally incorrect, horribly and horrifically incorrect. It's actually unnatural for a human being to not be empathetic, to not be caring, to not have a conscience. Why? Because different than all the rest of God's creations, we are not meant to be side actors. We're not meant to be props, scenery. We are not meant to just exist. Rather, God calls the beginning of his world not the day that he began, as we've talked about that, as we are about to celebrate. Rosh Hashanah is not the anniversary of the day that God started creating, because all that God was really doing was placing the props on the stage. You don't begin the show when you don't open the curtains to a bare stage and everybody sits there and watches as the stagehands set up the stage. That's not the start of the show. That's the preliminaries. That's what happened day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5 of creation. And that is why we don't put Rosh Hashanah, the anniversary of the beginning of the world, on days 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of creation. Rather, Rosh Hashanah is on day 6 of creation, the anniversary of day 6. Because on day 6, God put onto the stage those that will act, those that will execute, those who are the purpose, who will achieve the purpose of why God created the world in the first place. And that is humanity. When God created Adam and Eve, that's when the world started. Or actually, more accurately, not when God created them, but when Adam and Eve began to do what they were meant to do, when they started to do their purpose, they started to galvanize all of humanity towards its purpose. That's the moment the curtains come up and the story and creation begins. So humankind is not another animal. We are not dictated by the laws of Darwinism, the laws of the jungle. It's not just to exist and perpetuate our existence as the rest of the animals and creatures do, which is why there is the laws of the jungle, the survival of the fittest, et cetera, which is all to serve the survival instinct, the perpetuation instinct. That's not why we are here. We are not here just to perpetuate. We are here to achieve the purpose of the perpetuation of existence. We are here to be the reason that God set all this up, put out all the props, set up the stage. And if we are not doing this, if we are not working toward this, then we are going to feel very empty, very dissatisfied, very unhappy. And so when we bring the first of our fruits, the first of our successes, the first of our bounty and largesse, we go and we declare, God, not only do we acknowledge that this is not our success, but that it is your success, that you are the one whose blessing has yielded this success, but also that we are not looking at it as the success. We're not looking at it as the end game. Rather, we are looking at this as the resources and the assets to actually achieve the true success, which is the fruition of our purpose, the fruition of our mission, and we are using these assets to accomplish this. And that is, in fact, where our greatest joy comes from. So the challenge that becomes apparent to us when we are not struggling against outside circumstances, when we are not struggling against adversity and failure, but rather when we are feeling success and bounty, is to remind ourselves that that is not the end game. Rather, that is in fact the means to the end. And the means have to be incorporated in our effort to achieve the end. And we need to remind ourselves of this. And as we pick up an apple, and we pick up a vegetable, we make a bracha on it. Again, not just to remind us of the source of this blessing, but to remind us that this blessing is really an asset. It's really an investment. And with the energy that I will gain from this apple, or this, whatever it is, this blessing in my life, I will go out and use it to achieve more purpose. And may, as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah and another year where we ask God to give us all this blessing, because then it makes sense that on the holiest day of the year, and the Kohen Gadol, the holiest man in the holiest place on the holiest day, is asking for physical blessing, rain to come in its proper time, and the field should yield fruit. It's like, really? That's what you're going to ask the holiest man on the holiest day in the holiest place, is going to ask for something so materialistic? And the answer is not materialistic at all. The Kohen Gadol is turning to God and saying, on this all-important day, invest in us so that we can achieve your holy purpose and mission. That is the holiest thing the holiest man can do on the holiest day, is to say, God, please invest in us because we stand committed to using your investment to achieve the greatest purpose. All right, everybody?
Very nice.
Thank you
very
so much. That was-
Rabbi. Thank
Thank
you,
you. It
Rabbi.
was an amazing class. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
All right.
I mean, very
Thank you, Rabbi.
good.
I still say you owe me. And to that extent, Mendel Kaplan will not be having a minyan this Shabbos. His mother's very ill.
Right.
What time does your services, your Torah service start?
So
About?
the davening starts 10. we get to the Torah reading and kind of the Parsha discussion lead before the Torah service at 11.
Okay.
All right?
Okay, good. Hopefully, God willing, I'll see you this Shabbos.
We look forward to it.
Thank you.
All right. All the best.
Good Shabbos.
Thank you so much.
You know how I
Shabbat
know
shalom.
you're not
Thank you.
what's it called? You're not a selfish type of person?
How's that?
Because your last name is not Ilano, it's Yulano.
Yes, but it's also the same name as the Russian negotiator for the Iran deal.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Imagine we have Russian negotiators negotiating on our behalf with Iran who are colluding together, and they won't even let the U.S. representative in the same room.
Craziness. You're the
Yeah.
better Yulano.
Thank you. Good Shabbos.
Shabbos. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Shabbat shalom, Rabbi. Bye-bye.
Shalom.
Saturday, you mean.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
All right. All the best.
Well, too. Bye.